The town of Ravenshade stirred awake to the pale light of dawn, but something was wrong. The streets were still. The usual morning sounds, dogs barking, distant car engines, bird song, were absent. The air hung heavy, carrying an unnatural hush, like the world had paused and forgotten to start again. James Halpern, the town's baker, sat up in bed rubbing his temples. His alarm clock blinked a steady 6:00 a.m., the numbers glowing too bright in the dim room. He swung his legs over the bed, an uneasy tightness pressing against his chest. Something about the morning felt off. He tried to recall the night before. His routine was simple. Close the shop, take the trash out, lock up. But his mind reached for something that wasn't there. Across town, Eleanor Mendez, a retired schoolteacher, poured herself a cup of coffee with slow, deliberate movements. She leaned on her kitchen counter, frowning at the sensation in her head. Not quite a headache, but a blankness, an absence. She stirred her coffee absently, staring out her window at the empty street. The newspaper usually arrived by now, tossed onto her porch with its usual thud. She stepped outside, shivering against the crisp morning air, and looked around. The houses were quiet. Curtains remained drawn. Cars sat in driveways unmoved. It was a weekday. People should be leaving for work. At the police station, Sheriff Malcolm Graves clicked his pen against his desk. Reports had already started coming in, dozens of them, all saying the same thing. Nobody in Ravenshade remembered what had happened the night before. People woke up feeling strange, like they'd lost something. Graves tapped his fingers against his badge, staring at the phone on his desk. His own memory was a void. He had gone home, locked his door, sat down to watch the news, and then nothing. He had woken up fully dressed, his television remote on the floor beside the couch. His gun was still holstered, his car parked neatly outside his house. Nothing looked out of place. But the time between sunset and sunrise was missing, as if it had been plucked out of existence. Calls kept coming, concerned voices, confused questions. Did you hear anything? Did you see anything? Nobody had. By midday, the entire town knew. It wasn't just one person, not just a few. Everyone in Ravenshade, every single person, had lost the night. At the diner, conversations were hushed, urgent. People turned their coffee cups between their hands, eyes darting toward the windows as if expecting something to explain itself. Parents held on to their children a little tighter. The local radio station played static between songs, the DJ's voice oddly subdued when he spoke. A group of teenagers tested the edges of their lost time, piecing together what they did before everything went blank. Their last texts, their final social media posts. None of them had sent messages past 10:37 p.m. The timestamp stood out. 10:37 p.m. At exactly that moment, all records stopped. Phone calls ended. Messages went unsent. The town's security cameras confirmed it. When the police pulled the footage, every single camera, every street corner, every store, every home with a surveillance system showed the same thing. At 10:37 p.m., the footage cut to static. It stayed that way for hours. The world had gone dark. Sheriff Graves replayed the footage from the police station's own security feed, his jaw tightening with each second of flickering static. No power outage had been reported, no technical failures. The footage before 10:37 p.m. was perfectly normal. People walking down Main Street, headlights cutting through the early evening, the faint hum of small-town life carrying on as it always had. Then, nothing. Graves leaned back in his chair, eyes locked on the screen. He checked his watch. Afternoon shadows stretched long across his office walls. The reports kept coming. No one had answers. The town wasn't just missing time. Something had taken it. The next few days in Ravenshade passed in a blur of uncertainty and quiet desperation. The entire town had been struck by the same eerie, hollow feeling, like waking from a dream that evaporated the moment you tried to recall it. People tried to return to their routines, but there was a weight in the air, an unspoken knowledge that something was very wrong. Sheriff Graves tried to maintain control, gathering people in the town hall to discuss their next steps. Everyone had lost the same chunk of time, but nobody could agree on how to proceed. Was it a mass hallucination, a freak accident, or something darker, something far more sinister? "We need to focus on what we do know," Graves said, his voice cracking slightly in the tense silence of the meeting room. "And what we know is that nobody remembers anything from last night." The townspeople sat in rows, faces drawn, eyes wide, but no one said anything. Even the most outspoken residents, the kind who never hesitated to voice an opinion, were quiet now. All of them wore the same expression: unease, confusion, suspicion. "What about the cameras?" someone asked from the back of the room. Graves nodded, glancing down at the notepad in front of him. "They all show nothing. Static. Every single one. Even the ones in the shops and around the school." The room shifted with murmurs of disbelief. It was one thing for the town to forget the night, but the fact that even technology had failed them was a cold shock to everyone. There was no explanation for it. "I don't believe it," Eleanor Mendez whispered from the front row. Her frail hands shook as she clutched her purse tightly in her lap. "There has to be something. A mistake, maybe. Maybe there's a glitch." "Maybe," Graves replied, though he didn't believe it himself. His stomach had been gnawing at him since the first night, his gut telling him something was wrong in a way words couldn't explain. The sheriff paused, then added, "I've already spoken with the tech experts. No glitches, no malfunction. The footage is just gone." Another wave of disbelief rippled through the room. People exchanged worried glances, but nobody spoke. Eleanor shook her head again, the weight of the situation finally sinking in. This isn't normal." That night, the first hints of fear spread across Ravenshade like an infection. The streets were deserted earlier than usual. People stayed inside, drawn blinds keeping the dark outside. Families locked doors and houses felt colder than they should have. Even the moon seemed to hang too low in the sky, casting long, unnatural shadows that stretched across the town. In the silence, the town's paranoia began to spiral. James Halpern, the baker, found himself standing in front of the large windows of his shop, staring out into the night. The street was empty, as it had been for days. He could see the street lights flickering dimly, their glow casting pools of yellow on the sidewalk. It wasn't just the static footage or the strange lack of memory. It was the feeling of being watched. He couldn't shake it. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for the door to lock up, but before he could turn the key, he saw a shadow pass by the window. It was quick, too quick to be a person. James's heart thudded in his chest. His mind raced, his fingers clenching the doorknob. It was nothing, he told himself, just the wind. But the shadow came again and again, a faint tap on the glass. His breath hitched in his throat. James hesitated, staring through the glass at the empty street. No cars, no people, just the odd sway of the trees in the breeze. He swallowed hard and closed the door, locking it behind him. His fingers gripped the handle until his knuckles turned white. He didn't move for a moment, staring at his reflection in the glass. Then the tapping came again. The sound was soft at first, but it grew louder. James slowly turned, eyes scanning the dimly lit bakery. The darkness seemed to press in, making everything feel oppressive, claustrophobic. He didn't want to turn around, but he had no choice. He crossed the room, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The window's reflection stared back at him, nothing out of place. But the tap, tap, tap continued. James spun toward the door, throwing the latch back and swinging it open. But the street was still empty. Nothing was there. The tapping stopped as suddenly as it had begun. Across town, Eleanor Mendez stood at her kitchen window, watching the same empty street. She felt something, an unease so strong it rooted her to the spot. She hadn't gone outside in days, preferring to stay in the comfort of her home, where she felt a fragile illusion of safety. But even from behind her window, she could sense it. The same watching, the same waiting. A shadow crossed her yard, and she froze. It wasn't a person. It was something else. She reached for her phone, but the screen only showed static. The signal was dead. Her grip tightened around the phone as the shadow paused, then moved slowly toward her house. The street lights flickered once more, and she couldn't tear her eyes away from the movement outside. It stopped just beyond the edge of her porch. She couldn't see clearly from where she stood, but she could feel it. Something was out there. The next morning, another security footage report surfaced. This time, a glitch was found, but this one was different. At 2:04 a.m., the footage shifted to a single figure walking down Main Street. The man moved with unnerving purpose, his steps slow but deliberate. He passed every street light with an eerie calm, his shadow stretching too far behind him, as though it belonged to something larger, something wrong. But when they zoomed in on his face, the footage went completely black. Sheriff Graves reviewed it in his office, his fingers tight on the edge of the desk. His stomach churned as the shadow passed across the screen. There was something familiar about the figure, but he couldn't place it. The face. It was someone he knew, but the camera didn't capture the details. The face was obscured by shadow. The eyes, though, the eyes seemed to pierce through the screen, unblinking, and as the footage froze, Graves could swear he heard the faintest whisper, the sound of breathing, steady and deep, as though the figure had been waiting all along for someone to notice. And then the static returned. Graves turned the monitor off. His heart hammered in his chest. In the town square, people began to gather in small, uneasy groups, eyes scanning the streets for any signs of life. The paranoia was thick, but it wasn't just fear anymore. It was anger, suspicion, a rising tide of distrust. The town had always been small, but now it felt impossibly tiny, like everyone was suffocating in a space too small for them all. By the end of the week, the situation had worsened. More people reported strange occurrences, voices at their windows, whispers from the shadows, glimpses of figures that didn't belong. But the worst part was the quiet, the silence that hung in the air like a thick fog. Ravenshade was more empty than it had ever been. People stayed inside, too afraid to step outside, too afraid to talk to anyone. Every corner felt like a trap, and the static continued. It filled their phones, their radios, their televisions. It was everywhere, a constant reminder of the void. But one night, something changed. Sheriff Graves sat in his office, the lights dimmed, the town as quiet as it had ever been. His eyes felt heavy. The fatigue of the past days weighed on him. His fingers hovered over his phone, wondering if anyone had answers. But the signal was gone. The town's connection to the world had been severed. Suddenly, the door creaked open. Graves turned, his heart racing in his chest. But no one was there. He stood up, hand on his gun, but nothing moved. It was just the wind, or so he thought. But something was wrong. There, in the corner of his vision, he saw it. A faint shape, moving just beyond the doorway. A figure, the same one from the footage, the same face, the same eyes. And it was standing there, watching him. The final night of Ravenshade's descent into madness arrived like a storm, silent, yet ferocious. The town had already begun to crack under the pressure of what it had experienced. And now, there was only one thing left to do. The people of Ravenshade, despite their fear, could no longer ignore the inevitable. Sheriff Graves stood at the edge of the town square, his eyes scanning the darkness that stretched endlessly before him. The wind had picked up, carrying with it an eerie chill that seemed to seep through every crack, every gap in the buildings. It was as if the air itself had been infected by the silence, the darkness. Nothing in the town was alive anymore. Not really. A few souls wandered the streets, but their movements were slow, methodical, like marionettes caught in a web they couldn't escape. They didn't speak, didn't look at each other. There was no sound except the rustling of leaves in the wind, the occasional groan of an old house settling under the pressure of time. Graves was the only one still clinging to the hope that some answer, some solution could be found. But the more he searched, the more he realized the truth. The town was being consumed. It wasn't just the memory of the night they had lost. It was their very souls, slipping through the cracks of time like sand through fingers. Across the square, Eleanor Mendez stood by the fountain, staring down at the water. It was still, reflecting the empty sky above. She hadn't spoken to anyone in days, not since the last meeting at town hall. The once vibrant woman had become a shell, her eyes sunken and distant, as if her body was no longer fully aware of the world around her. She had stopped hoping. She had stopped fighting. Then, as though summoned by some invisible force, the figure appeared. The same shadow, the same silhouette that had haunted them for days now, stood in the center of the square where the fountain's water should have been. It wasn't a man, not entirely. There was something inhuman about it, something that didn't belong to this world. Its shape was fluid, constantly shifting, like it could slip between the fabric of reality itself. The air around it warped, bending as if the figure were distorting the space in its vicinity. Graves felt the familiar chill run down his spine as the figure turned its head toward him. Its eyes, those eyes, burned with a strange, otherworldly intensity. They seemed to pierce the very core of his being, stripping him bare of every thought, every feeling, until there was nothing left but the raw terror that flooded his veins. For the first time, Graves felt small. He had always been the sheriff, the protector, the one who held the town together. But now, in front of this figure, he was nothing. The figure stepped forward, its movements slow but sure. As it walked, the air around it seemed to grow colder, denser. Shadows stretched across the square, twisting and curling as though they were alive. The town itself seemed to bend, groan, and shift, like it were waking up from a long, uncomfortable slumber. Eleanor turned, drawn to the figure by an unseen force. Her breath hitched in her throat as she watched the creature draw nearer. It wasn't just an entity. It was a presence, a thing of ancient power, and it was here for them, for all of them. The figure stopped before her, its shape flickering like a candle's flame in the wind. Graves couldn't move. He wanted to shout, to run, to do something, anything, but his limbs refused to obey. His mind raced, desperately seeking a way to stop what was happening, but no solution came. There was nothing he could do. The figure extended a hand, long, spindly fingers that seemed to reach out of the very darkness itself. Slowly, deliberately, it touched the surface of the fountain's water. At its touch, the water began to ripple. The surface of the water shimmered and glowed, then began to churn, swirling in impossible patterns. The ground trembled, as though the very earth was cracking open beneath them. Graves heard the soft sound of whispered voices on the wind. Voices he knew, voices he had heard before. They were familiar, but distant, like echoes from the past. Eleanor's eyes widened as she stepped closer to the fountain. She could see them now, the faces, the people of the town, their expressions frozen in time, trapped beneath the water's surface. They were all there, their eyes wide in terror, their mouths open in silent scream. But there was something else, a shape, a single figure standing among them. It was her. Eleanor gasped as the realization hit her. The figure beneath the water, the one who was holding the others in place, was her. She was the one who had caused this. In that moment, everything became clear. The figure before her wasn't just a shadow. It was the thing she had become, the thing they had all unknowingly summoned by their actions, their fear, their unwillingness to face the truth. The truth was simple. They had all forgotten, not because of a glitch or some unnatural event, but because they had chosen to forget. The memories they had lost weren't just of the night. They were of everything. The years they had spent running from their fears, from their mistakes. They had forgotten because it was easier than remembering. It was easier than facing the truth of what they had done to each other, to the town, to themselves. And now the figure was here to remind them. The water continued to swirl, and with it, the ground cracked wider, deeper. It was as if the earth itself was being torn apart, revealing the truth buried beneath it. The town had been built on lies, on the refusal to confront what had happened all those years ago. The people of Ravenshade had turned their backs on their history, and now it had come back to haunt them. As the water churned and bubbled, the figure reached into the depths of the fountain. A sharp crack of thunder split the air, and the sound of something heavy, something old, being pulled from the depths, echoed through the square. The figure slowly withdrew its hand, and as it did, something emerged from the water. A book. It was large, ancient, its cover cracked and weathered with age. The pages within were yellowed, brittle with time, but there was something familiar about it. Eleanor recognized it immediately. It was the town's history, its secrets, the things they had tried to bury beneath the surface. The figure held the book out to her, its eyes boring into hers. She stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. She reached out slowly, almost hesitantly, and took the book from its hands. As soon as her fingers brushed the cover, the world shifted. The streets around them began to crumble, breaking apart as though the town itself was being erased from existence. The air hummed with the energy of something ancient, something powerful, as if reality itself was coming undone. Graves watched in horror as the world around him twisted, contorted, and then in an instant, it all stopped. The figure was gone. The book had vanished. The town was silent. The streets were still. The air was thick with the weight of the truth. And then, for the first time since this nightmare began, Ravenshade was at peace. But it was not the peace they had hoped for. It was not the peace they had imagined. The town of Ravenshade had been wiped clean, not just from memory, but from existence. What had been a town, what had been a place of lives, of stories, of families, was now nothing more than a forgotten whisper. There were no survivors. Only echoes remained, carried on the wind, a faint reminder of what was lost. And as the final remnants of the town faded away, the sun began to rise. But this time, it was a new dawn, one where Ravenshade would never be remembered again.